April 15th, 1945. The morning mist hung low over the rolling hills of Bavaria as the first American convoys rumbled through the shattered gates of Dachau concentration camp. Among the liberating forces of the 42nd Infantry Division, Sergeant Marcus Washington of the 369th Infantry Regiment adjusted his helmet and surveyed the scene before him with eyes that had witnessed the brutality of war across 3 continents. The 24-year-old from Detroit had no idea that this moment would challenge everything he thought he knew about human dignity, prejudice, and the complex web of assumptions that bind societies together. What he and his fellow soldiers were about to witness among the recently captured German auxiliary personnel would reveal truths that military intelligence reports could never convey. Truths about fear, propaganda, and the startling reality of encountering those they had been taught to see as less than human. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Over the next 72 hours, a group of German women who had served in administrative roles at various facilities would find their carefully constructed worldview shattered, not by violence or intimidation, but by the simple act of witnessing dignity, competence, and humanity where they had been conditioned to expect none. The liberation of Dachau represented more than just the freeing of 32,000 prisoners. It marked a collision between realities that propaganda had kept carefully separated. The 369th Infantry Regiment, an African-American unit that had fought with distinction from Italy to the Rhine, now found themselves face to face with individuals whose understanding of the world had been shaped by 12 years of systematic indoctrination. Among the auxiliary personnel captured during the facility's liberation were 47 German women, ranging in age from 19 to 53, who had worked in various administrative capacities. These women, many of whom had never personally encountered African Americans before the war, had spent years absorbing propaganda that painted them as primitive, dangerous, and fundamentally different from civilized Europeans. Sergeant Washington, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall with the broad shoulders that had made him a standout athlete at Wayne State University before the war, represented everything these women had been taught to fear. Yet as he organized the temporary holding area with methodical efficiency, checking supplies with the same attention to detail that had earned him commendations in Sicily and Anzio, the reaction he observed was not the terror he had expected, but something far more complex, a mixture of bewilderment, curiosity, and the gradual crumbling of deeply held beliefs. The first indication that something significant was occurring came from Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, the unit's commanding officer, who noticed unusual behavior among the detained personnel during the initial processing. Unlike the sullen resistance or outright hostility they had encountered from male prisoners of war, the German women seemed transfixed by their captors, whispering among themselves in rapid German that the unit's interpreter, Corporal Robert Chen, found both fascinating and troubling to translate. "They are not what we were told," whispered Greta Müller, a 32-year-old from Munich who had worked as a filing clerk, to her companion Maria Hoffmann, a 19-year-old from a small Bavarian village. Müller's voice carried a note of confusion that would become increasingly common over the following days. "Look at how they organize everything. Look at their discipline." Maria, whose only exposure to the wider world had come through carefully controlled Nazi educational materials, found herself unable to reconcile the reality before her with the images that had filled her school textbooks. The African-American soldiers moved with professional competence, their equipment maintained to exacting standards, their interactions with both prisoners and each other marked by a level of organization that contradicted everything she had been taught about racial hierarchies. Corporal Chen, whose own family had emigrated from China 20 years earlier, understood perhaps better than most the weight of stereotypes and the shock of their dissolution. As he translated the women's conversations for his commanding officers, he noted recurring themes that revealed the depth of their cognitive dissonance. The women repeatedly commented on the soldiers' height, their bearing, their obvious education, and most surprisingly, their treatment of German prisoners, a treatment marked by firm but humane efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the brutality these women had witnessed from their own forces. The systematic nature of the propaganda these women had absorbed became clear through interviews conducted by Captain William Hayes, a psychology professor from Columbia University, who had been assigned to gather intelligence about civilian morale and indoctrination effectiveness. Hayes, working through interpreters, discovered that many of the women had constructed elaborate mental frameworks to explain away any positive encounters with African Americans they might have had through pre-war films or music. Jazz music, for instance, had been reframed in their education as a primitive expression that proved rather than contradicted racial stereotypes. "We were taught that they were like children," explained Anna Kruger, a 41-year-old supervisor who had overseen supply logistics. "Strong but simple, requiring guidance from superior races. But these men," she paused, struggling to find words in her limited English, "they command themselves, they read maps, they make decisions." The revelation that many of these soldiers were college-educated came as perhaps the greatest shock. Sergeant Washington, who spoke fluent French and had studied engineering before the war, found himself reluctantly drawn into conversations with some of the more educated German women who possessed basic English skills. These exchanges, initially formal and cautious, gradually revealed the extent to which Nazi racial theory had shaped expectations about intellectual capacity and cultural sophistication. Dr. Elizabeth Weber, a 38-year-old who had held a doctorate in literature before the war and had been assigned to document translation work, found her academic worldview particularly challenged. Her education had taught her to view cultural achievement as the exclusive domain of European civilization. Yet here were soldiers who discussed literature, debated political philosophy, and demonstrated knowledge of European history that often exceeded her own. "I was raised to believe that civilization flowed from Europe outward," Weber confided to Captain Hayes during one of their interviews. "That culture, real culture, belonged to us. But this Sergeant Washington, he knows Goethe better than many Germans I have met. How can this be?" The question haunted many of the women as they spent days in close proximity to their captors. The camp's temporary nature meant that normal segregation protocols were relaxed, creating opportunities for observation and interaction that would have been impossible under typical prisoner-of-war conditions. The African-American soldiers, aware they were being scrutinized, maintained their professional demeanor while gradually becoming curious about their observers' reactions. Private First Class James Robinson, a 22-year-old from Chicago who had worked as a journalist before the war, began keeping detailed notes about the interactions he witnessed. His observations, later included in military intelligence reports, documented a pattern of behavior among the German women that suggested rapid psychological adjustment to realities that contradicted their previous education. "Day 3 of detention operations," Robinson wrote in his journal. "The German auxiliaries are no longer avoiding eye contact. Several have attempted to engage in conversation, asking questions about American geography, about our families, about our education. There's something almost desperate in their curiosity, as if they're trying to rebuild their understanding of the world from the ground up." This rebuilding process manifested itself in various ways throughout the camp. Some women began to pay closer attention to the soldiers' personal habits, their cleanliness, their care for equipment, their interactions with each other. Others focused on professional competence, noting how efficiently supplies were distributed, how quickly communication lines were established, how thoroughly security protocols were implemented. Maria Hoffman, the youngest of the detainees, found herself particularly fascinated by the medical corps personnel. Corporal Thomas Anderson, a 26-year-old medic from Boston who had completed 2 years of medical school before enlisting, had established a small aid station to treat minor injuries among both American personnel and German prisoners. Hoffman, who had been trained as a nurse before the war, watched him work with growing amazement. "His hands," she told Greta Mueller one evening as they were assigned to help with camp sanitation duties, "they are so gentle, so precise. At the hospital in Munich, we were taught that only German doctors possessed the delicate touch necessary for proper medical care. But this man, he sutured Herr Brennan's cut yesterday with such skill. I have never seen better technique." The medical interactions proved particularly powerful in breaking down preconceptions. Because they involved direct, intimate human contact. When several of the German women developed minor ailments, stress-related headaches, digestive issues from the change in diet, small injuries from unfamiliar work assignments, they were treated by the same African-American medics who cared for American personnel. The quality of care they received, delivered with professional compassion and thorough medical knowledge, challenged fundamental assumptions about racial competence in areas requiring education and training. Corporal Anderson, unaware of the philosophical crisis his medical care was creating, simply continued to follow his training and his personal ethics. His gentle manner with elderly German prisoners, his patient explanation of medical procedures, and his obvious medical knowledge gradually earned him a reputation among the detainees that would have been impossible for them to imagine just days earlier. Before the war, Anna Kruger later told Captain Hayes, "If someone had told me that a Negro doctor would save my son's life, I would have said they were telling fairy tales. Now I watch this man work and I think, how many fairy tales have I been living?" The question of fairy tales versus reality became central to many of the women's psychological adjustment process. The systematic nature of their previous education meant that contradictory evidence required not just acceptance of new facts, but a complete reconstruction of their understanding of human capability and racial difference. This reconstruction was facilitated by the extended duration of their detention, which lasted nearly 2 weeks due to administrative complications in processing civilian auxiliary personnel. Unlike the brief encounters that might have been dismissed as anomalous, the sustained contact forced a gradual recognition that the competence and dignity they observed were not exceptional but representative. Sergeant Washington found himself reluctantly drawn into philosophical discussions with Dr. Weber, whose excellent English and obvious intellectual curiosity made her a natural conversation partner during the long evening hours when official duties were light. These conversations, initially focused on practical matters like camp organization and supply distribution, gradually evolved into deeper exchanges about education, culture, and the nature of human potential. "In my university studies," Weber explained during one such conversation, "we were taught that intelligence follows clear patterns based on ancestry and breeding. That certain capabilities were inherited rather than learned. But you speak of engineering concepts that I know require years of mathematical training. Your solutions to our water supply problems show understanding of principles that my education told me were—" She paused, searching for diplomatic language, "beyond certain people's natural abilities." Washington, who had grown up navigating similar assumptions in segregated Detroit, understood the magnitude of the adjustment Weber was attempting. His response was measured and educational rather than confrontational, recognizing an opportunity to challenge misconceptions through patient explanation rather than angry rebuttal. "Mathematics doesn't care about the color of the skin of the person using it," Washington replied with the calm confidence that had made him an effective leader. "Engineering principles work the same way regardless of who applies them. What varies isn't human capability, but human opportunity." The concept of opportunity versus inherent ability proved revolutionary for many of the German women, who had been educated to view social and economic hierarchies as natural reflections of biological reality. The African-American soldiers, they now observed, represented living proof that given equivalent opportunities, education, training, resources, human achievement followed patterns that contradicted everything they had been taught about racial limitations. This realization was particularly powerful for the younger women, whose worldviews were less firmly established and who possessed greater psychological flexibility to accommodate new information. Maria Hoffman began asking increasingly sophisticated questions about American education, about the soldiers' family backgrounds, about the social structures that had made their achievements possible. "Sergeant Washington tells me his father was a factory worker," she confided to Anna Kruger one evening. "But he attended university, studied engineering, learned French from books. If our teachers were correct about natural limitations, how is this possible? How does a worker's son master subjects that we were told required generations of proper breeding?" The question highlighted the central contradiction at the heart of Nazi racial theory, the assumption that social outcomes reflected biological destiny rather than social opportunity. For women who had been raised to view their own elevated status as evidence of natural superiority, encountering individuals who had achieved equivalent or greater educational attainment, despite starting from disadvantaged positions, created cognitive dissonance that required fundamental philosophical adjustment. Captain Hayes, in his psychological assessments, noted that this adjustment process followed predictable patterns. Initial denial gave way to grudging acknowledgement of exceptional cases, which gradually evolved into recognition of systematic patterns that contradicted previous assumptions. The final stage involved attempts to reconstruct understanding of human potential based on evidence rather than ideology. Subject displays classic symptoms of cognitive dissonance resolution, Hayes wrote in his report about Dr. Weber. Previous framework unable to accommodate contrary evidence, leading to systematic reconstruction of worldview. Process appears painful, but ultimately liberating for subjects with sufficient intellectual flexibility. Not all of the women possessed such flexibility. Some, particularly those whose identities were more closely tied to the racial hierarchies of Nazi ideology, struggled to accept evidence that contradicted their fundamental beliefs. These individuals developed elaborate explanations for what they observed. The African American soldiers must have been specially selected for their exceptional qualities. They must have received unusual educational opportunities. They must represent the absolute best of their population rather than typical examples. Greta Mueller found herself caught between these competing explanations and the evidence of her daily observations. Her background as a filing clerk had made her naturally attentive to detail and patterns, skills that now forced her to confront the systematic nature of the competence she witnessed among her captors. Every morning, she told Maria Hoffman, I watch them organize the camp. Everyone knows their duties. Everyone performs them well. Equipment is maintained perfectly. Schedules are followed precisely. If these were exceptional men, there might be one or two who stand out. But all of them, every single one, shows the same level of discipline and skill. How can an entire unit be exceptional? The question identified the core flaw in attempts to explain away contradictory evidence through appeals to exceptionalism. The systematic nature of the competence these women observed made it impossible to dismiss as anomalous or unrepresentative. The 369th Infantry Regiment represented not a collection of unusual individuals, but a normal military unit, performing at standards that contradicted fundamental assumptions about racial capability. This realization proved particularly troubling for women whose personal identities were closely tied to assumptions of racial superiority. If African Americans could demonstrate equivalent or superior performance in areas requiring intelligence, discipline, and cultural sophistication, what did that suggest about the natural hierarchies they had been taught to view as inevitable? The question became more pressing as the women observed interactions between the African American soldiers and white American personnel. The integrated nature of the liberating forces, while limited by the segregated structure of the American military, still provided opportunities for the German women to observe professional cooperation between racial groups that their education had taught them to view as naturally antagonistic. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, whose Mississippi background had given him his own complex relationship with racial assumptions, found himself inadvertently contributing to the German women's education through his professional interactions with his African American subordinates. His obvious respect for Sergeant Washington's expertise, his reliance on Corporal Anderson's medical judgment, and his casual acceptance of intellectual contributions from soldiers, his background might have predisposed him to underestimate, provided powerful examples of functional cooperation across racial lines. The American colonel treats his Negro soldiers as equals, Anna Kruger observed to Dr. Weber, not as servants or as children requiring guidance, but as men whose opinions matter, whose expertise is valued. How can this be if our teachers were correct about natural hierarchies? The observation highlighted another crucial aspect of the German women's education that was being challenged, the assumption that racial hierarchies were universally recognized and naturally maintained by all advanced societies. The evidence of American military integration, however limited, suggested that other approaches to racial organization were not only possible but practically successful. Dr. Weber, whose academic background had given her exposure to comparative social systems, found this aspect of American military culture particularly fascinating. Her conversations with Captain Hayes revealed a sophisticated understanding of the implications of what she was observing. In our universities, Weber explained, we studied American society as an example of natural racial hierarchy properly maintained through separation. We were taught that Americans understood racial realities better than most Europeans because they had direct experience with African populations. But what I see here suggests that American racial practices are more complex than our professors understood. Hayes, who had spent considerable time studying Nazi indoctrination techniques, recognized the significance of Weber's observation. The German educational system had selectively presented information about American racial practices to support Nazi ideology, emphasizing segregation and discrimination while ignoring examples of integration and achievement that contradicted racial hierarchies. Your professors showed you only part of American reality, Hayes explained. They emphasized aspects that supported their theories while ignoring evidence that contradicted them. What you're seeing now is a more complete picture of American society's complexity. The revelation that their education had been deliberately selective rather than comprehensively accurate proved deeply troubling for many of the German women. If their professors had misrepresented American racial practices, what other aspects of their education might have been similarly distorted? The question opened floodgates of doubt about information they had previously accepted without question. Maria Hoffman, whose youth made her particularly adaptable to new information, began systematically questioning other aspects of her education through conversations with various American personnel. Her discussions with Corporal Chen about Asian Americans, her interactions with Jewish American soldiers, and her observations of Catholic and Protestant cooperation within American units gradually revealed a picture of American society far more diverse and complex than her German education had suggested. Everything I learned about America was wrong, she told Greta Mueller after a particularly enlightening conversation with Private Robinson about racial integration in northern cities. Not just incomplete, actually wrong. If they lied about this, what else was false? The question haunted many of the women as they began to recognize the systematic nature of the misinformation they had received. The process was particularly painful for older women whose worldviews had been shaped by decades of consistent messaging from educational institutions, media, and social authorities. Anna Kruger found herself caught between loyalty to the beliefs that had organized her adult life and the undeniable evidence of her current experience. Her struggle with this conflict became apparent to Captain Hayes during their regular interviews, revealing the psychological difficulty of abandoning fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. For 20 years, Kruger explained, I believed certain things about the world. These beliefs guided my decisions about marriage, about raising my children, about my work, about everything important in my life. Now you show me that these beliefs were built on false information. How do I rebuild everything I thought I knew? The question identified one of the most challenging aspects of the psychological transformation these women were experiencing. Abandoning beliefs about racial hierarchy required not just intellectual adjustment, but emotional reconstruction of personal identity and social understanding. Captain Hayes, working with military chaplains and medical personnel, developed informal counseling approaches to help the German women navigate this psychological transition. The process involved gradual exposure to contradictory evidence, combined with opportunities to discuss their reactions and develop new frameworks for understanding human diversity and potential. The goal, Hayes explained to Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, is not to create American converts, but to help these women develop more accurate and flexible ways of understanding human capability. Many of them will return to Germany after the war. The attitudes they carry home could influence an entire generation. This long-term perspective added urgency to the careful treatment of the German women during their detention. Rather than simply processing them through standard prisoner protocols, the American command recognized an opportunity to combat Nazi ideology through direct experience rather than propaganda. The approach proved remarkably effective with younger and more educated detainees who possessed both the intellectual tools and the psychological flexibility necessary to accommodate contradictory evidence. Maria Hoffman and Dr. Weber, in particular, underwent profound transformations in their understanding of race, culture, and human potential during their 2 weeks in American custody. Hoffman's transformation was particularly dramatic because of her age and the formative nature of her current experiences. Her detailed journal, which she continued writing throughout her detention and which was later donated to American military historians, provided a day-by-day account of her evolving understanding. Day 7, she wrote, Sergeant Washington helped me understand why American Negroes could become soldiers. He says in the North, colored children attend the same schools as white children, learn the same subjects, read the same books. When I asked how this was possible if they were inferior, he said they are not inferior, only denied equal opportunities in some places. This idea would have seemed impossible to me 1 week ago. Now I begin to think it might explain everything I have observed. The revelation that educational and social opportunities, rather than inherent limitations, determined human achievement represented a fundamental paradigm shift for many of the women. It suggested that the hierarchies they had been taught to view as natural might actually reflect social policies rather than biological realities. This understanding proved particularly powerful when combined with direct observation of the African American soldiers' family photographs, letters from home, and personal stories about their civilian lives. Private Robinson, whose education in journalism had made him particularly articulate about social issues, found himself serving as an informal ambassador for American racial complexity during evening conversations with interested German detainees. My wife is a teacher, Robinson explained to a small group of women during one such conversation. She has a college degree, teaches mathematics to high school students. My brother is studying to become a doctor. My father owns a small business in Chicago. We live in the same neighborhoods as white families, send our children to the same schools. What you were taught about American Negroes living like primitives, that might be true in some places, but it is not the complete picture. The personal nature of these revelations, the photographs of suburban homes, the letters discussing college plans, the casual mention of professional achievements, made abstract discussions of racial equality concrete and immediate. For women who had been taught to view racial mixing as impossible or unnatural, evidence of successful integration at personal and family levels challenged fundamental assumptions about human social organization. Greta Mueller found herself particularly affected by stories about African American family life, having been taught that strong family structures were impossible without proper racial breeding. The letters that soldiers shared, the photographs they carried, and the stories they told revealed complex, stable, loving families that contradicted everything she had learned about racial differences in emotional and social capacity. They love their children the same way we love ours, she confided to Anna Kruger after seeing Sergeant Washington's family photographs. They worry about education, about future opportunities, about safety and happiness. Their letters home sound exactly like letters my husband sends me when he travels for work. How can this be, if they are so different from us? The question highlighted one of the most powerful aspects of the German women's education, the recognition of shared humanity across racial lines. For individuals who had been taught to view racial differences as fundamental and unbridgeable, evidence of common emotional experiences, family structures, and personal concerns provided compelling proof of essential human similarity. This recognition was facilitated by the extended nature of their detention, which allowed time for casual conversations and informal interactions that revealed personality and character beyond formal military roles. The African American soldiers, initially cautious about fraternizing with former enemy personnel, gradually relaxed their guard as they recognized genuine curiosity rather than hostility in many of the German women's questions. Corporal Anderson, whose medical training had given him natural compassion for human suffering, regardless of nationality, found himself drawn into increasingly personal conversations with Dr. Weber, whose academic background and obvious intelligence made her a fascinating conversation partner, despite their recent status as enemies. "She reminds me of my professors back in Boston," Anderson confided to Sergeant Washington. "Same kind of intellectual curiosity, same way of asking questions that make you think about things from new angles. It's hard to remember sometimes that 3 weeks ago, she was working for people who wanted to kill us." The personal connections that developed between individual American soldiers and German detainees proved crucial in humanizing both sides of the racial equation. For German women who had been taught to view African Americans as fundamentally different from themselves, discovering common interests, shared values, and similar aspirations provided powerful evidence of underlying human unity. Dr. Weber's friendship with Corporal Anderson became particularly significant because both shared medical and scientific interests that transcended racial boundaries. Their discussions about anatomy, physiology, and medical procedures revealed identical understanding of human biological reality that contradicted racial theories about fundamental physical differences between population groups. "When we discuss the human circulatory system," Weber later told Captain Hayes, "there is no difference between his knowledge and mine. Blood flows the same way in all humans, hearts pump with the same mechanisms, lungs process oxygen through identical processes. If our bodies work exactly the same way, how can our minds be fundamentally different?" The scientific perspective proved particularly powerful in challenging racial ideology because it provided objective, verifiable evidence that contradicted subjective assumptions about human difference. Weber's medical education had given her tools for evaluating evidence that made it impossible to dismiss Anderson's obvious competence as anomalous or exceptional. Similar scientific discussions occurred throughout the camp as educated German personnel encountered African American soldiers whose technical knowledge matched or exceeded their own. Sergeant Washington's engineering background led to detailed conversations about construction principles, metallurgy, and mathematical concepts that revealed sophisticated understanding of complex technical subjects. These interactions were particularly important because they demonstrated intellectual achievement in areas that Nazi ideology claimed were beyond African capability. Engineering and medicine required precisely the kinds of abstract reasoning and technical precision that racial theories suggested were impossible for non-European populations. The cumulative effect of these individual revelations created a crisis of belief that forced many of the German women to choose between maintaining previous assumptions and accepting evidence that contradicted them. For individuals with sufficient intellectual honesty and psychological flexibility, the choice increasingly favored evidence over ideology. Maria Hoffman's personal transformation became a model for this broader process of ideological adjustment. Her youth and relative lack of investment in previous beliefs made her particularly adaptable to new information. But her systematic approach to questioning and evaluation provided a template that other women gradually adopted. "I have decided," she announced to her companions during their final week of detention, "that everything I was taught about race was designed to make me feel superior to people who are not actually inferior. This was done to support political goals, not to teach me truth about human nature." The clarity and decisiveness of Hoffman's conclusion reflected the outcome of her systematic evaluation of contradictory evidence. Rather than attempting to preserve elements of previous beliefs through elaborate rationalizations, she had chosen to abandon the entire framework and construct new understanding based on direct observation. Her approach influenced other women who had been struggling with similar contradictions, but had lacked the intellectual confidence to completely abandon their previous education. Hoffman's obvious intelligence and careful reasoning made her conclusions difficult to dismiss as emotional or impulsive. Dr. Weber, whose academic training had given her sophisticated tools for evaluating evidence and reasoning, reached similar conclusions through a more gradual and methodical process. Her transformation was particularly significant because of her educational credentials and intellectual authority among the other detainees. "As a scholar," Weber explained to Captain Hayes during one of their final interviews, "I am trained to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it contradicts my previous assumptions. The evidence I have observed here leads to only one possible conclusion, that human intellectual and moral capacity is distributed equally across racial groups, and that observed differences in achievement reflect opportunity rather than ability. Weber's scientific approach to evaluating her observations provided a model for rational assessment that other women found compelling. Her willingness to apply academic standards of evidence and reasoning to personal beliefs about race demonstrated intellectual integrity that commanded respect, even from those who struggled to accept her conclusions. The final week of detention brought increasing urgency to these discussions, as the women realized their time for direct observation and interaction was ending. Many expressed anxiety about returning to German society with radically altered views about race and human potential, recognizing that their new understanding would conflict with prevailing social attitudes. Anna Kruger, whose middle-aged status and family responsibilities made her particularly concerned about social conformity, struggled with the practical implications of her changed beliefs. Her conversations with Captain Hayes revealed the difficulty of maintaining new understanding in an environment that remained committed to contradictory ideologies. "When I return home," Kruger explained, "how do I explain to my neighbors what I have learned? How do I raise my children with different beliefs about race than those held by their teachers, their friends' families, the authorities in our community? Will they think I have become a traitor to my own people?" The question highlighted one of the most challenging aspects of ideological transformation, the social isolation that could result from abandoning beliefs that provided community identity and belonging. For individuals whose entire social network shared common assumptions about racial hierarchy, adopting contradictory views threatened personal relationships and social acceptance. Captain Hayes, recognizing the long-term significance of the women's transformed understanding, worked with military chaplains to provide counseling about maintaining personal integrity while navigating social pressure to conform. The guidance emphasized gradual influence rather than confrontational advocacy, suggesting ways to share new perspectives without directly challenging community authorities. "Truth has its own power," Chaplain Robert Morrison explained to the women during one of his final group sessions. "You don't need to convince everyone immediately. Simply live according to what you now understand about human dignity and potential. Your example will influence others over time." The advice proved prescient for many of the women who successfully maintained their transformed understanding of race, despite returning to communities that remained committed to Nazi ideology. Follow-up interviews conducted by American intelligence personnel in the early post-war period revealed that several of the women had become quiet advocates for racial tolerance within their families and social circles. Maria Hoffman's post-war trajectory became particularly significant because of her decision to pursue nursing training with an explicit commitment to treating patients without regard to racial or ethnic background. Her work in displaced persons camps brought her into contact with survivors from across Europe, providing additional opportunities to apply and strengthen her understanding of human equality. "My experience with the American soldiers taught me that human worth cannot be determined by appearance or ancestry," Hoffman wrote in a letter to Corporal Anderson 5 years after the war. "This understanding has guided my nursing career and my life. I treat every patient with the same care and respect because I learned that beneath the surface, we are all fundamentally the same." Dr. Weber's post-war career proved equally influenced by her transformed understanding of race and human potential. Her decision to focus her academic work on comparative literature across cultural boundaries reflected her new appreciation for the universal elements of human experience that transcended racial and ethnic differences. "My detention experience taught me that human creativity and intelligence appear in all populations and cultures," Weber explained in a post-war academic paper. "My research now focuses on identifying common themes and shared aspirations that unite rather than divide human societies." The long-term impact of the German women's encounters with African American liberators extended beyond individual transformation to influence broader social attitudes in post-war Germany. Several of the women became teachers, social workers, and community leaders whose transformed understanding of race contributed to more tolerant attitudes in their spheres of influence. Greta Mueller's work with refugee resettlement programs brought her into contact with survivors from across Europe and beyond, providing opportunities to apply her new understanding of human dignity to practical humanitarian efforts. Her approach to client services, emphasizing individual worth regardless of background, reflected the fundamental shift in perspective that had occurred during her detention. I learned from my American captors that human value cannot be determined by external characteristics, Mella wrote in her memoirs 40 years after the war. This lesson guided my work with refugees and displaced persons, helping me see past surface differences to recognize the common humanity that unites us all. The cumulative effect of these individual transformations contributed to broader changes in German social attitudes during the post-war reconstruction period. While multiple factors influenced Germany's eventual rejection of racial ideology, the personal testimonies of individuals who had direct experience with racial integration provided compelling counter-narratives to Nazi racial theory. The documented experiences of the German women detention program became part of American military intelligence assessments of denazification effectiveness, providing evidence that direct contact and personal interaction could achieve ideological transformation more effectively than abstract education or propaganda campaigns. Subject group demonstrated significant and apparently permanent modification of racial attitudes following extended contact with African American military personnel, concluded the final military intelligence report on the program. Personal interaction with competent, educated individuals from previously demonized groups appears to be highly effective in countering ideological indoctrination. Recommendations for occupation policy should emphasize opportunities for positive interracial contact. The recommendations influenced American occupation policies in ways that extended the impact of the detention program beyond its immediate participants. Military government policies that encouraged rather than prohibited interracial contact helped create additional opportunities for German civilians to encounter contradictory evidence about racial theories through direct personal experience. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, reflecting on the program's outcomes in his post-war memoirs, emphasized the transformative power of simple human contact across racial lines. His observations about the rapid changes in the German women's attitudes influenced his own understanding of racial prejudice and its potential solutions. "I witnessed something remarkable in those 2 weeks," Patterson wrote. "Women who had been raised to see my Negro soldiers as inferior beings gradually came to recognize them as fellow human beings, deserving of respect and dignity. The transformation occurred not through argument or coercion, but simply through the opportunity to observe competence, character, and humanity in action." Patterson's testimony proved particularly significant because of his Mississippi background and his own initial skepticism about racial integration. His professional observations about the effectiveness of interracial contact in changing attitudes carried weight with military and civilian authorities who shared similar backgrounds and assumptions. The African American soldiers who participated in the program also underwent their own transformations, gaining increased confidence in their ability to challenge racial stereotypes through example rather than confrontation. The experience of being recognized and respected by individuals who had initially viewed them as inferior provided powerful validation of their worth and dignity. Sergeant Washington's post-war career in engineering was significantly influenced by his detention camp experiences, which had given him opportunities to demonstrate technical competence to skeptical observers and to recognize the power of professional excellence in challenging racial assumptions. "Those German women taught me something important about prejudice," Washington explained in a post-war interview. "They showed me that even people who have been systematically taught to hate and fear, you can learn to see you as human if given the chance to observe your actual character and capabilities." This understanding guided my approach to racial integration throughout my civilian career. Washington's success as a civil engineer in post-war Detroit included deliberate efforts to mentor young African Americans entering technical fields, emphasizing the importance of professional excellence as a tool for challenging racial barriers. His approach reflected lessons learned during his interaction with the German women about the power of competence and character to overcome prejudicial assumptions. Corporal Anderson's medical career was similarly influenced by his detention camp experiences, which had demonstrated the transformative power of professional compassion and medical competence in changing racial attitudes. His post-war practice emphasized treating all patients with equal care and respect, recognizing that personal interaction could challenge assumptions as effectively as political advocacy. My experience treating German patients taught me that healing transcends racial boundaries, Anderson explained in a medical journal article about post-war integration. When people are suffering, their response to competent, compassionate care is the same regardless of the racial background of the provider. This understanding helped me build a successful integrated practice in an era when such approaches were still controversial. The medical model proved particularly powerful because it emphasized shared human vulnerability and common biological reality that transcended racial differences. Anderson's success in treating patients across racial lines provided practical demonstration of professional integration that influenced broader community attitudes about racial cooperation. Private Robinson's journalism career was profoundly shaped by his detention camp experiences, which had given him unique insight into the process of ideological transformation and the power of personal testimony to challenge systematic prejudice. His post-war reporting focused on racial integration success stories that provided positive examples rather than simply documenting discrimination. I learned from those German women that people's minds can change when they encounter evidence that contradicts their assumptions, Robinson explained in a journalism conference presentation. My reporting strategy focused on providing such evidence through human interest stories that demonstrated racial cooperation and shared achievement. Robinson's approach influenced a generation of civil rights journalism that emphasized positive examples of integration rather than only documenting instances of discrimination and conflict. His work provided practical models for racial cooperation that helped normalize integration in readers' minds. The detention program's influence extended beyond its immediate participants to affect broader American military policies regarding racial integration and international relations. The documented success of interracial cooperation in changing German attitudes provided evidence that influenced post-war integration policies within the American armed forces. Military personnel who had observed the program's effectiveness became advocates for increased integration opportunities, arguing that competent performance by African American soldiers in integrated settings provided the most effective challenge to racial prejudice among both American and international observers. The best argument for integration is successful integration, argued Colonel Patterson in testimony before post-war military integration committees. Our German detention program proved that when Negro soldiers have opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities in integrated settings, prejudicial attitudes change rapidly and permanently. The testimony contributed to growing military support for racial integration that culminated in the official desegregation of American armed forces in 1948. The practical experience gained through programs like the German women detention camps provided evidence that integration could enhance rather than undermine military effectiveness. The international implications of the program also influenced American foreign policy approaches to racial issues during the early Cold War period. The documented ability of American racial integration to impress and influence foreign observers became part of arguments for civil rights advancement as a tool of international diplomacy. State Department officials cited the German women detention program as evidence that American racial progress could serve national security interests by demonstrating democratic values to international audiences. The personal testimonies of transformed German women provided powerful propaganda tools for countering Soviet criticisms of American racial practices. The ability of our Negro soldiers to win the respect and admiration of former enemies through professional competence demonstrates the potential of American democracy to transcend racial divisions, argued one State Department memorandum, citing the program's results. Such examples provide more effective international propaganda than any abstract statements about equality and freedom. The pragmatic argument for civil rights as a tool of international influence proved particularly effective with policymakers who might have remained skeptical of moral arguments for racial equality. The documented success of integration in changing foreign attitudes provided concrete evidence that racial progress served national interests. The long-term legacy of the German women detention program extended far beyond its immediate participants to influence broader social transformation in both Germany and the United States. The documented experiences of individuals who had undergone fundamental changes in racial understanding provided models and inspiration for others facing similar transformations. Educational institutions in both countries eventually incorporated stories from the program into curricula designed to teach about the nature of prejudice and the possibility of its correction. The personal testimonies of both German women and African American soldiers provided compelling examples of human capacity for growth and change. Maria Hoffmann's post-war speaking career took her to universities across Europe and America, where she shared her transformation story with students and community groups. Her presentations emphasized the systematic nature of racial indoctrination and the possibility of escape from prejudicial thinking through direct experience and honest evaluation. "I was not born a racist," Hoffmann would tell her audiences. "I was taught to be one through systematic misinformation about human differences and capabilities. But I learned that what can be taught can also be unlearned when we have courage to examine evidence that contradicts our assumptions." Her message proved particularly powerful for young people who were beginning to form their own attitudes about racial difference and social organization. The personal nature of her testimony made abstract discussions of prejudice concrete and immediate. Dr. Weber's academic career included groundbreaking research on the psychology of ideological transformation, drawing on her personal experience and observations from the detention program. Her work contributed to growing understanding of how systematic prejudice could be challenged through structured intergroup contact. Prejudice is learned behavior that can be unlearned under proper conditions, Weber argued in her influential post-war research. The key factors are sustained contact, equal status interaction, and opportunities to observe competence in valued activities. When these conditions are met, even deeply ingrained racial attitudes can change rapidly and permanently. Weber's research provided theoretical framework for integration programs that were implemented throughout the post-war period. Her personal credibility, as someone who had undergone fundamental transformation, lent authority to her academic conclusions about the possibility of changing racial attitudes. The scientific approach to understanding prejudice reduction that emerged from studies of the detention program influenced social psychology research for decades. The documented changes in the German women's attitudes provided case study material for researchers investigating the conditions under which intergroup contact could reduce hostility and increase cooperation. Academic conferences throughout the 1950s and 60s featured presentations about the program's methodology and outcomes, contributing to growing scholarly consensus about the effectiveness of structured intergroup contact in reducing prejudice. The personal testimonies of participants provided compelling human evidence for theoretical propositions about attitude change. The program's influence on American civil rights strategy proved equally significant, as movement leaders recognized the power of competent performance in integrated settings to challenge racial assumptions. The model of change through demonstration rather than confrontation influenced tactical approaches throughout the civil rights era. The German Women program showed us that people's minds can change when they see Negro competence and character in action, explained one civil rights leader in a strategy session. "Our job is to create opportunities for such demonstrations in American communities." The strategic emphasis on creating opportunities for positive interracial contact influenced everything from school integration policies to employment discrimination challenges. The understanding that prejudice could be reduced through structured contact provided theoretical foundation for integration as both goal and method of social change. Military veterans who had participated in or observed the program became community leaders who applied its lessons to civilian integration challenges. Their personal experience with successful racial cooperation provided credibility for arguments about the possibility and benefits of integration in civilian settings. Churches, schools, businesses, and community organizations throughout the post-war period benefited from leadership by individuals who had learned through military experience that racial cooperation was both possible and beneficial. The practical knowledge gained through programs like the detention camp experiment provided foundation for successful integration efforts across American society. The international impact of the program's documentation continued throughout the Cold War period, as American diplomats used success stories of racial integration to counter Soviet propaganda about American racial practices. The personal testimonies of transformed German women provided compelling evidence of American democratic values in action. Cultural exchange programs modeled on the detention camp experience brought international visitors into contact with integrated American institutions, providing opportunities for first-hand observation of racial cooperation. The documented effectiveness of such contact in changing attitudes made it a central component of American public diplomacy. The educational materials developed from the program's experiences influenced anti-prejudice curricula in schools throughout the Western world. The personal stories of transformation provided age-appropriate examples for students, learning about the nature of prejudice and the possibility of overcoming it. Children's books, educational films, and classroom materials drew on the documented experiences of program participants to illustrate lessons about human equality and the dangers of racial stereotyping. The compelling personal narratives made abstract concepts accessible to young learners. The program's legacy in German society proved particularly significant as the country grappled with confronting and overcoming its Nazi past. The testimonies of women who had been personally transformed through contact with their former enemies provided models for broader social reconciliation and democratization. Truth and reconciliation processes implemented in various post-war contexts drew on lessons learned from the German women detention program about the power of personal testimony and structured contact to overcome historical hostilities. The documented success of the program provided evidence that even deeply ingrained prejudices could be changed through appropriate intervention. The 50th anniversary of the program's implementation brought renewed attention to its lessons and legacy, with academic conferences, documentary films, and memorial events highlighting its contribution to understanding prejudice reduction and social transformation. The surviving participants, now elderly, shared their memories and insights about the lasting impact of their brief but transformative encounter. "That 2 weeks in 1945 changed the entire course of my life," reflected Maria Hoffman, now in her 70s, during an anniversary commemoration. "It taught me that human beings are capable of growth, change, and redemption, regardless of how deeply we may be trapped in mistaken beliefs. That lesson has guided everything I have done since." Her reflection captured the enduring significance of the program's central insight, that even the most systematic and deeply ingrained prejudices could be overcome through the simple but powerful experience of human contact across racial lines. The documented transformation of the German women provided lasting evidence that change was possible and showed how it could be achieved. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.